This is somebody's worst fear. And we're an embodiment of that.
Welcome to the Strokecast. A Generation X stroke survivor explores rehab, recovery, the frontiers of neuroscience, and how to peel a banana with one hand.
Hello, I'm Bill Monroe, and welcome to episode 146 of the Strokecast. Today's episode is brought to you by the fine folks at Modus Nova. To find out if Modus Nova can help you recover the use of an affected limb after stroke, visit strokecast.com/Modus Nova. And by the fine folks at Like-Minded. To learn if this nonprofit membership community can help you live your best post-stroke life, visit strokecast.com/like-minded. One spring day this year, I turned 50. I spent much of that day sort of alternately celebrating and pondering just what this means for my life. And I monologued about that back at the time, so I won't belabor that point too much. But while spending all that time in my head and figuring, what does this mean and all of that fun stuff, and I probably also ended up attending a few work meetings and things like that, some pretty mundane stuff. What's got me talking about this now, though, is thinking about how we hear these stories in other people's lives. And we tell a lot of stories here on this show. You've heard my story a lot. Everybody has their own story. And yet, those stories aren't just in pure isolation. Even if they're not connected with one another's stories, all of those stories are still happening at the same time. And it's kind of weird to think that while here I was in Seattle, recognizing my 50th birthday, at that very same time, about 600 miles away, Misha Montana was having her own milestone event in life. She was having a stroke and joining our club that nobody ever wants to join. Misha is still new in her stroke journey, though. I mean, we recorded this interview 6 months to the day following her stroke, and yet she seems to have the insights and reflections that feel like she's had a couple of years to live with this experience. And maybe that's because the experience she's had raising her own special needs son, or the challenges that come from her work and the way the rest of the world views her work. Or maybe it's just because she's always been an overachiever. I mean, the recurring theme you'll hear from her in this conversation is 100%. Regardless, I mean, she is an absolute joy to chat with live, or even in our messaging back and forth on Instagram to make all this happen. Before we go any further, though, let's talk a little bit about Misha's work. Misha is a producer, a director, a brand manager, and an actress in the adult entertainment industry. She's a porn star. That means we do acknowledge the existence of the industry and sex work in this conversation. So keep that in mind if you continue listening. And regardless of how you feel about the industry, I do hope you keep listening, because Misha is a delightful ball of energy and determination. So now, let's meet Misha Montana.
Which is so interesting that it's almost like your brain subconsciously knows there's an issue even without you recognizing it. I had almost the exact similar thing happen where I noticed that I couldn't talk. And that was the biggest tell where I was concerned. It started with the talking that I noticed, and then you start feeling the side of your face, and then for me it was my right arm and right hand, and that went deep down inside. I knew there was something seriously wrong. Even so, though, the symptoms are not so severe where it's a lot of pain or something that could be identified as a potential emergency situation where, like, heart attack or, something more obvious, I guess you could say. I recognized there was something wrong, but then I WebMD'd it because which of course you do, right? That's exactly the first thing to do. I was like, and I'm 31 years old. So of course the first thing I type in all my symptoms, and the first thing was, it's a stroke. You need to go to the hospital immediately. But then in my mind, I'm like, there's no way that I'm having a stroke. Why am I having a stroke? That doesn't make sense. So it's one of those times where WebMD was 100% correct.
Right.
And I was not. This happened about 9:00 at night. I was in Susanville, California. I'm from Reno, Nevada, and I had gone up to Susanville. It's about a 2-hour drive north, and it's literally a little teeny tiny mountain town. The population is, barely 100 people, I'd imagine, and there aren't resources there. It's a very, very quaint area with very little reception. I have no idea what kind of services they have as far as medical or fire or police. I'm not quite sure. So that was part of it too, where I was in a strange location and I thought, well, I'll just wait till the morning and see if this goes away.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a mistake ultimately that I made. I'm thankful that it didn't affect me even more severely than it did because I had waited so long. I went to bed. It was about 8:30 at night, 9:00. And of course I felt uneasy. I didn't sleep well. And I woke up and I still had these symptoms and they were getting worse. My hand was getting tighter. I thought then I needed to get to a hospital. And instead of going to the nearest hospital, which I didn't know where it was or what kind of services they had, I drove myself back to Reno, which is about 2 hours away. Which, again, that was frowned upon. When I got to the hospital, I walked in and I had my mask on. Obviously, this is COVID times. This happened on April 14th of this year of 2021.
Wow.
So it's actually, I wanted to do this with you, Bill, because it's my 6-month anniversary this week.
That's right. Well, happy birthday.
Thank you. That meant a lot to me to do it 6 months post. When I got there, after driving myself 2 hours and panicking, the entire way too, at that point, I knew there was something wrong and it needed attention, which, like you said, it's kind of an insidious feeling. Like it wasn't so apparent that it was an emergency situation, but my body and my brain knew there was something serious happening. And I needed to get to the hospital for whatever reason I thought that I needed to get to the hospital. And I did. So I drove myself 2 hours to the hospital, walked in, and I took my mask off. And I was trying to convince them. I was like, isn't this a bug bite? Or, we had a couple margaritas that night. So I'm like, it could be something. I'm in a weird place. Maybe they didn't get their shrimp from the right vendor. And they immediately, I pull my mask off and it was about 2 seconds. They go, oh yeah, you're having a stroke. And that's when they start calling, the codes. And immediately I was taken back to the emergency room. And that's when they wire you up and the IVs and everything. And the whole time still, I'm just like, really? I mean, are you sure? Are you sure this is a stroke? And initially they did a CAT scan first, I believe, and it didn't come back conclusively with any kind of brain damage that would indicate a stroke. But when they did an MRI, they did see where the stroke was in the left frontal lobe. So my right side was affected. And for some reason, the brilliant doctors, this is why I drove back to Reno, by the way, because I had fabulous care there. I had my neurologist graduated from Johns Hopkins. I had wonderful doctors. Thank God for that. He was able to recognize, because it was unusual, which I'm learning all of these things obviously now, that my stroke happened in the left side of my brain. Apparently it's more common, you might know more also on the subject too, that they occur in the right side of the brain. So the location of the stroke indicated to them that I had a previously undiagnosed heart condition. I have a PFO, which is a hole in my heart. So on top of having a stroke, I'm learning now that their theory with why I had a stroke was because I had developed a blood clot and it traveled to my heart and my heart shot it to my brain and therefore caused a stroke, which is just a lot to take in too. There are a lot of components to that. It's like, wow, well, one, why did I have a blood clot? And they determined in their theories that I had a COVID related blood clot. And it was interesting because that was one of the things, when we were going over medical history, when I first was on site at the hospital, I had just gotten my second vaccine shot. What they ultimately determined was I got a shot early because I have a high risk son who has cerebral palsy, and my father is extremely high risk. So I was able to get in that first group of people that were allowed the vaccine. But the issue I had was when I got the vaccine, I still had COVID. I had an active COVID infection when I got my first shot. And apparently that's what they're discovering now, is that I had too much COVID in my system. And for some reason, the clotting agent of COVID itself was ultimately responsible for me developing these blood clots, which that's what it was such a bizarre situation, because I am a basically healthy person and active, and there's no reason otherwise for me to have a stroke at 31 years old. So they definitely determined it was COVID related in some capacity. So, which is insane too, about just how dangerous COVID is. And people really diminish the danger of COVID. This is a very serious disease, especially if it's causing these kind of clots and ultimately causing strokes in people that are younger and otherwise healthy. It's a very serious issue.
Yeah, that's one of those things about COVID, is that even if you recover from it, and a lot of people say, oh yeah, most people recover. Yeah, they do, but they're set up for a lifetime of disability from reduced lung capacity, reduced kidney function, heart damage to the heart muscle, and the significantly higher risk of stroke. I mean, we're going to be hearing 5 years from now about people who are dying from the COVID infection they had this year.
100%. And that's terrifying. Absolutely terrifying. And it's becoming more prevalent. I think now people are really seeing the implications of this. And it was interesting that you referenced the girl that had the stroke on the air, because when I was having my stroke, the reason why I ultimately went to the hospital and thought this might actually be a stroke was because about a week before, I had heard about stroke cases related to COVID. And I think the story was kind of pushed more. There was a vaccine side effect. And there was only a handful of people, but it got some kind of, media traction.
Yeah.
And I remember hearing the story. And of course, my mind, I'm like, well, I just had COVID and I just had the vaccine. And here I am having stroke symptoms. This is an odd coincidence, if anything, And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. So you're right. I think the damage is not seen yet, ultimately, from COVID. It's going to be an interesting few years when all of these things start coming out. The real damage, I've heard from friends of mine, have had serious inflammation problems in their brain and their heart, all from COVID. And these are previously unexplained illnesses and diseases and disabilities. Before COVID, people didn't have these kinds of, these are serious medical problems. This is not a light issue. It's not just you get the flu and that's it, you move on. This is very serious. If you're having blood clots and strokes and heart issues and other major organ failures and function difficulties, that's incredibly serious.
Yeah, very, very much so. Earlier in the year, I was talking with, we had Dr. Jason Hinman from UCLA on, and he was actually doing his research into why COVID or how COVID infections are leading to an increase in stroke and a number of these other conditions. And what their research has been showing is that, it's just the nature of the design of the virus. With the spikes on the virus, they're actually irritating the inner lining of the blood vessels, making the body think that the blood vessel is broken. So, of course, once the body sees a broken blood vessel, its first instinct is, let's clot that so we can keep the blood in place. Well, now you've got all these extra clots that you got to deal with. And normally the body is great at filtering that stuff out. But then when you throw in a hole in the heart, that PFO, which everybody has in utero when we're a fetus and developing, because we're not breathing air. So the idea is that your blood doesn't need to go to your lungs until after you're born. So the blood just flows straight from one side of the heart to the other. After you're born, in the first 30 days, most people have that hole in the heart just close naturally. About a third of the population, it doesn't close. So we're all walking around with holes in our hearts, which means that when a blood clot makes it into the right side of the heart, it doesn't go to the lungs to be filtered out. Instead, it just shoots right through that hole into the left side and then gets shot up through the rest of the body. It's amazing how all that stuff comes together. And terrifying.
Oh, it's so terrifying. The process is just, it's so scary to think about that happening within you silently. And finding that out after the fact too, like, wow, I mean, that's what was going on inside of my body. And they closed my PFO about a month after I had the stroke. So I did have the procedure to have that hole closed because they're so concerned about having more blood clots and having another stroke. And our risk is so much higher now too, because we've already had one. And it's so, the effects are unknown at this point too. They really don't have a large understanding of how this disease works. So it scares them, and it scares me too, and it should scare everyone that they don't have an understanding of how this virus works. They're learning. And unfortunately, cases like mine and other stroke, COVID-related stroke patients, they're using that to help other people that potentially can suffer from this. But it's scary to know that this is a new virus. It has new serious implications, and I feel almost like a little test subject for COVID research, but I'm happy to be that if it helps other people. And my situation is just absolutely so bizarre with all these combined factors that created the perfect storm for this situation. And I'm so happy to be alive, first and foremost. Like, it definitely changes your perspective on life. I had a similar experience with being grounded and thankful and grateful several years ago when my son was born. He actually had a stroke in the right side of his brain, which caused cerebral palsy, and he's left side affected. So it's a really interesting harmonious relationship between the two of us. And here I have this child that has special needs, and I've learned patience and gratitude for the past 5 years taking care of him. And now to have this situation happen again too, it just really makes you thankful for every single thing that you have every day, little things. I feel like when we're in this group of survivors, it's kind of like a club where we recognize just how precious life is on a level that I don't think other people can be sympathetic to unless they've been in it themselves.
Yeah.
So in a way, that's a great gift. It really is. Like I truly consider this a blessing. And to survive it is the ultimate blessing. And to be mostly functioning, and there are definitely some lingering side effects, which was interesting to see. That I have been in and out of doctors for the last 6 months, and they kept saying, just wait till your 6-month mark and that'll be your baseline. And I'm a little bit frustrated with, where my baseline has ultimately settled, I believe, because the biggest thing for me, my speech was definitely the worst part for me. And so that's something that I still have to work on in therapy constantly. I think it's gotten a lot better. I'd say my recovery is about 90% from what it was before. But the biggest thing for me, which people say it's kind of irritating when they're like, well, you recovered, you look great, good for you, you survived. And then they just kind of close that book. Where for me, it's every day I think about this, because it's the internal damage that really is ultimately affecting me. My memory is gone. Short-term memory is pretty much non-existent. I can't remember people, names, faces, even just events. I don't know what day it is half the time, which I know a lot of people struggle with that anyway. But it's like the cognitive effects of this are definitely severe for me. I have really serious depression following the stroke, and obviously like anxiety and fear and of having another stroke, or kind of I wouldn't even say it was irrational. I guess it could be rationalized that I could die any day. And not that we couldn't before, but I think these experiences enhance that fear sometimes. So I've been working through dealing with some really serious depressive issues and episodes, and it seems like it's getting better. And with me, I have to tell myself, this is why you feel this way. Your brain is not well. It's not that you actually are sad or have these feelings and the world is ending. It's just my brain is digesting things differently than it used to. So it's a lot to take in. And I know, on the surface, when you recover, if you're lucky enough, I was lucky enough to be able to physically recover for the most part. And that's a blessing in itself. But I still have paralysis in the side of my face and my mouth. These are things that are daily reminders for me that this happened. Every time I, touch my face and it's numb, I'm reminded constantly throughout the day of what happened. So it is a blessing. It's definitely a blessing. And it's nice to have a little reminder in a way, just so that you don't get too carried away with not being thankful for everything that you have, because I'm ultimately so thankful for literally everything in my life. I'm very, very thankful to have survived this and to be among a community that I just absolutely love. Every person that's reached out to me, which is a lot. I've had quite a few people reach out to me about being survivors themselves, and that's a beautiful relationship, and it's a wonderful connection that I've made with a lot of stroke survivors, and those relationships mean the most to me. And even talking with you and being on this podcast, I do a lot of interviews and a lot of podcasts, and stroke interviews and podcasts mean the most to me, especially with fellow survivors also.
Well, that's fantastic. I always say, the Stroke Club is filled with amazing people. It's just that the dues really suck.
100%. 100%. It's a high cost.
That's an amazing story and the path that you've been on. And with your son, I mean, once he gets a bit taller, you two can stand next to each other and you'll have two fully functional arms that you can work with there.
100%. Wouldn't that be great? We'll be like the Siamese twins. We'll just sew each other together. That'd be perfect. But I know it's such a bizarre thing. Such a bizarre, the way that went full circle too. It's like to have it happen on the opposite side and have similar things affected. It's just like, what a bizarre situation.
Exactly. I think that's one of those other things too. People think that you can't have a stroke until you're old, but they've all heard of people with cerebral palsy and don't realize that roughly half of all cerebral palsy cases are due to a stroke in utero or shortly after birth.
Yes, exactly. And that's particularly what happened in his case. And I had never known anything about that before. I knew nothing about cerebral palsy before I had him. And of course, when he was diagnosed, my interpretation of what cerebral palsy was is really severe. And with him, luckily, similar situation with me, he doesn't have a severe case. He still is able to function. And again, for people that don't have a personal relationship with any kind of a stroke disease, they just assume on the surface, like, oh, he looks normal enough. And same with me, oh, you guys look great. I can't even tell. But it's like, well, that's great that you can't tell, but the damage is there. Yeah. And when you really start magnifying, that's great you can't tell in the 5 seconds that you speak with me or with him in his case. But you definitely, when you put the magnifying glass onto us, you can start seeing the damages. And even when I have conversations with people and they didn't previously know that I had a stroke, then after talking to me for an extended period of time, whether they just are looking at my face and how I talk, they're like, oh yeah, I can kind of tell. I was like, okay, which is fine with me too. I mean, it happened. It's nothing to be ashamed of. I'm very happy and proud to be alive. So I don't think it's something disgraceful or something to be ashamed of or sensitive of. It's something that we all experienced. And I want to shed light on strokes. And I wanted to show people, which is why I actually went back to work 2 weeks later.
Wow.
After having a stroke, against the advice of my medical team, as well as my boyfriend, and everyone in my life was like, well, you need to slow down here. Like, this is, we don't really even know why you had a stroke at this point. So, and I'm a workaholic. I'm definitely a perfectionist, and I do overwork myself. I spread myself too thin. And so everyone was really concerned about my health going back into work. But it was important to me to get back to work because I wanted to show everyone that you can go back to your life. It was ultimately, it was selfish of me to do that because I was proving it to myself first and foremost. Like, I wanted to show myself that I'm capable of doing my job. I have a highly physical job. I'm in the adult entertainment industry, and it's extremely physical. And for me, not being able to use my hand and mouth the same way that I was before, that seriously affects my job. And I actually made a joke when I had an interview with Daily Mail, and the headline that they pulled from this is that it's porn star jokes that she has to do left-handed hand jobs for the rest of her life. I'm like, oh, great. I'm glad that was the title that got pulled from that. But, and I was joking. I was making light of it, but I was 100% serious too, because I didn't know. I mean, that was one of the first things when this was happening. I'm like, what is going to happen to my career if I can't perform, if I physically or mentally. I mean, I have a lot of mental deficits. And that's why I wanted to get back to work so soon. But I really wanted to show people that this can't be an ender for you. This is just the beginning. I actually had, at this time when the stroke happened, a documentary series about me was already happening because I have an extremely bizarre tattoo in my pubic region. So it's kind of this infamous tattoo that I have. And the documentary was originally based around the process that I had with this tattoo. And that obviously changed completely when the stroke happened. And I just so happened to have a lot of footage of me in the hospital and going through recovery. And it ended up being this really beautiful documentary series. It's called The Inksploitation of Misha Montana. And it became just this labor of love project for me too, because I've never been, obviously I've been in the spotlight because of the nature of my career, but in a way that I always dictated. I always wanted to be private and keep private things in my life. Like, for example, my son, I've never talked about previously before this. I never intended to. And this documentary and this situation really changed my perspective on trying to humanize my industry that I'm in. Because so often people look at us in a derogatory way and a negative way, and they don't see us as human beings. They don't think that we're even deserving of having things happen to us like this, because we're not humans in a lot of people's eyes. So that was critically important to me, to show everybody, regardless of profession, religion or philosophical association, that I'm a human being and these are real things that happen, and these are the challenges that we face. And for everyone out there who's had a stroke or any kind of serious life-changing event in their life, I have a platform that I want to use for good, for those people, for survivors, for everyone. And I've actually gotten a lot of positive feedback from people, from strangers that message me all the time, and they say, thank you for talking about this. And I really didn't think it was that impactful. But now that I'm seeing the feedback, it does mean something to people, because so often, no matter what industry you're in, I think there's this feeling of, not belonging anymore or abandonment. And I don't want people to feel like that ever. I don't want people to feel like there's any reason for them to stop doing what they love. And that's why it's so important to me to be at the forefront of spreading awareness in this. And that's why I went back to work 2 weeks later.
I think one of the things that's really interesting is that so many people just want to be heard and just want to be acknowledged. And regardless of the industry you're in, when you can offer that platform and just be able to say to other folks who've had a stroke, I see you, I hear you, I'm with you.
100%. It is, and it really is big. And again, I don't think the majority of the population would really understand just how much that means unless they're a survivor themselves. And that's who reaches out to me a lot. And they're the ones who say, like, this means the world to me, because I feel like I'm heard, even if it's, through you. And that's amazing. That's the most incredible feeling in the whole world, is to have that.
When you're talking about these invisible disabilities, I mean, that's why that stuff is so insidious. I mean, I know a lot of folks who may have some, whether they're dealing with living with aphasia or living with memory challenges or any of the other things, who have their disabilities much more seriously impact their life than mine, where I just can't really use my left hand, and when I'm out and about, I'm walking with a cane and an AFO. I mean, those are visible disabilities, and people see that and they think about how much hard that is. I'm like, you know what? This really isn't that terrible.
Right. Compared to other things. Oh, 100%. Not that it diminishes your disability in any way, shape, or form, but you're right. There's an extra layer of challenge because it's already, when you have a disability, there's already kind of a stigma attached, and people's perception of you automatically changes, whether they feel sorry for you or, they don't understand. So they're probably a little bit more hesitant to engage in relationships with you, or they don't know how to talk to you. It's kind of an interesting human experiment to watch how people interact with people with disabilities, because their brain just doesn't allow them to look at you as an equal at that point either.
Right. And we scare the heck out of them because they look at us and they're like, hey, this could happen to me.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's an interesting point too, because it makes them uncomfortable seeing you, especially people that aren't, like you said, you expect this to happen when you're 80 years old. When you're in your 30s and 40s, that's too real for them. They can't process that, and they don't want to, because it's scary. And when we're a walking, living example of what can happen to you, this is somebody's worst fear, and we're an embodiment of that. So I understand why people, are hesitant to engage with us, but I want to break those barriers down. Absolutely. And say, this is a scary thing. There's no doubt about it. But if you are lucky enough as we are to be able to survive this, then it's what you do with your life after the stroke. Everything before, to me, it didn't matter what I did. Everything now, every minute of every day matters. So it's, what am I going to do with that time? And it's not that we have no idea when our time is up. But when you go through an event like this, it just magnifies that importance of your life so much more. And every second is just crucial with what you're going to do next. So my goal is to leave a positive impact on everyone in my life, and hopefully be able to touch others in a positive way, and really try to bring awareness to strokes. Because like you've said too, and I've listened to your podcast before, and there's not enough information about strokes out there, and a lot of people don't talk about it. The community doesn't have a lot of representation. So I think it's really important, the work that you're doing, and I'm so happy to be able to contribute in a positive way to it as I can too. It's important, and we need to be spreading more awareness and information and education about this.
Absolutely. And it's the work we're all doing as a part of this, as a part of whether that's going ahead and building out a platform to talk about this on a regular basis, or whether it's just going out and living our lives and being the people that we can be. That is the work of spreading awareness and letting everybody know there is another side to this.
100%. There's life. There's life and opportunity after a stroke. We're living our best lives here, or trying to, and that it doesn't have to be a death sentence in any way. If you're lucky enough to survive, then you can still have a family. You can still function. It's difficult, 100%. I struggle daily because of those deficits. It just makes it more challenging, but it's a welcome challenge. It's what is the alternative? Do you lay down in a hole, give up? I mean, we don't really have a choice.
I got too much stuff to do still.
Exactly. Like, we have things to do. I nap a lot. I get way too tired mentally. I think it's more mental exhaustion throughout the day than physical. Physically, I was able to do a lot more. I've always been really big on working out and having a lot of energy. So, and people, I think that's the biggest thing is people don't recognize now just how difficult it is for me mentally and physically, how connected that is, because they don't understand why I'm so tired. And they, in their mind, they're like, you recovered from the stroke. You can't use that as an excuse anymore. And it's like shocking to me that it's, you put a Band-Aid over it and then you pretend like it never happened or it happened, you're recovered and therefore you don't have any other implications. I'm exhausted by 2:00 in the afternoon. I have nothing left to give at that point. And people just don't understand. They think I'm being standoffish or weird and just not myself. And this is something really serious that still affects me when I tell them it's, from my stroke, because that I was never like that before. Obviously that's, one of the deficits I have, and people just don't understand that still. They just cannot understand that I still have exhaustion from that. And they don't understand. It's so weird to me that they don't. But then you think, I look fine to them and it happened 6 months ago. So why am I still acting like this is bothering me?
Yeah. It's not like a cut in the skin that heals over with maybe a light scar. There's a big chunk of brain cells that are gone and they're not coming back, and everything else has to work overtime to make up for that.
100%. And that's the perfect way to describe it to other people that don't understand either, because we understand and we physically and mentally and emotionally experience this constantly. And for other people who are just like, oh, well, get over it. This happened 6 months ago. Why are you still saying this? Why are you still using this as an excuse? Or everything is an excuse tied back to the stroke. I'm like, it's not an excuse. It's an explanation.
Yeah.
It's not an excuse. This is my new life. This is the new me. And these are adjustments that I have to make internally and externally all day, every day. And therefore, everyone in your life is impacted by that too. Your deficits don't just impact you. It definitely affects everyone and everything around you also.
Absolutely. Everyone else in our life, they had their lives turned upside down too. Their plans changed when we had that stroke too. Their plans for the future, our financial stability, their roles and responsibilities, all of that stuff changes in an instant.
100%. Like it definitely affects people so much deeper than just having a stroke, surviving it, and moving on with your life and everything is fine. Your life is forever changed, as well as, like you said, everyone in your life. My life will never be the same. Your life will never be the same. And all of our loved ones, and even people that, I work with, my colleagues, their lives are impacted by this. You have to approach me now in a setting that was previously totally different. And I have to constantly tell people that I had a stroke, because otherwise they mistake some of my mannerisms, or, I repeat myself constantly because of the aphasia that I have. I don't remember things. I don't intentionally mean to be late. I forget things all the time. It's changed the way I have to live my life, because I have to be so much more conscious of things that I have going on. When you have a busy schedule and you have appointments and things you have to be there for, I've never missed so many appointments in my life. I'll miss an appointment and then I call them and then they're just furious that I just no showed. And it's legitimately not a personality flaw. Like, I'm telling you, it's not. I was never like that before. It's frustrating to me to have these deficits where I'm battling these demons constantly, and they're impacting my day-to-day life on sometimes a really large scale in a negative way. It's difficult enough to try to wrestle with them all day long and keep them contained, but when they start popping out, and it gets overwhelming. And that's where a lot of this kind of like the cycle of depression and anger and like self-loathing comes from. A lot of those situations where it's like I'm mad at myself that I didn't remember something.
And then that feeds on itself. That's even more exhausting, which contributes to the problem further, and it just cascades. And especially as sort of a freelancer and an entrepreneur, that becomes a huge thing too.
100%. It's extremely taxing and difficult, because then once you get into that negative headspace too, I'm tired, I want to sleep more, I sleep more during the day, then I'm not productive, then I get more depressed. If I'm not working out or moving or doing creative things or working, then I get into a dark place. And that's why too I was so bent on working so much, because I need work to distract myself and to keep on track.
And it's tied up into your identity. So many of us, we define ourselves by the work that we do. And once we have a stroke, well, now we've already upended our identity as a younger person, for the most part healthy. And now suddenly this has happened. Who am I now? And how do I get back to who I was before? And does that even matter?
Yeah, your identity is definitely shaken by these kind of events, because any previous identity that you attach to for however long in your life, that's not you anymore. And I tell people that all the time. I'm not the same person. I might look like the same person. I am not. I am definitely not the same person, regardless of if I can handle and manage my depression and some of the physical exhaustion and the mental deficits. Ultimately, I feel like a different person. My internal dialogue is different. How I look at the world is forever changed. And that's why being in a community of people that resonate with that and they understand and relate to that is so important to me, because people really just don't understand unless they've been through it. And that's kind of polarizing too, when you already have a serious life and health event like this happen, and then you already kind of feel alienated and different because of that and whatever things that you're going through physically, mentally, and emotionally. But then on top of it, to be even further alienated by the general society because of these deficits, it just goes into, it can be really problematic. And I see why people struggle so much with being depressed by their stroke. And because it happens to me, I know exactly how it feels to be in that headspace. And that's why, with the ability that we have with platforms to discuss these things and let people know, one, I hear you, I feel you, you're not alone. And two, for everyone else that may not have as well of an understanding of these kind of ailments that we have, it's important that people learn to be sympathetic with survivors, because the damage is long lasting. It's going to be for the rest of our lives. This is something that we will carry forever, and it will impact us in one way or another and everyone else in our lives. So it's important that people understand how to interact and engage with survivors. One of my areas of study in college is psychology. So I kind of had that ability before. I've always been sympathetic with people intentionally. I've always been conscious of other people's feelings and trying to put myself into their shoes. And so it's interesting to be on this end of things, asking people to do the same, not just for me, but for everyone. And it's really apparent when you start looking for that kind of attitude and emotion in people, they just don't have it, or they don't have the ability, the willingness to try to step outside of their own comfort zone. So I think breaking those barriers down is incredibly important. It's critical to just understanding each other as human beings on a basic level. And how difficult it really is to get that is really kind of interesting and disturbing.
One of the things that strikes me that's really interesting here too, and you talk about how, obviously you can't know what this experience is like if you haven't been through, and all these different challenges of people not really knowing how to approach this and how to talk about all this stuff. In some respects, and again, now as an outsider, it almost sounds like those are some of the same concerns that could apply to your experience as an adult entertainer and working in that industry. Do you see any parallels there, or how has that experience prepared you for the stroke experience?
Well, that's an interesting parallel that I've noticed for sure, because in my industry too, I came from, my upbringing was relatively normal. I lived, with my parents who were both still married. My father was an attorney. My mother worked at Starbucks for 13 years. I had a very normal, wonderful, happy upbringing. I'm blessed that I was able to get a world-class education, and people are always confused by my choice to be in porn. A lot of times they're absolutely dumbfounded that I would be in porn. And I have always felt ostracized because of that choice too. And I don't think people understand just how difficult it is to be in the adult sex industry. I've seen so much evil from outside of the industry. Within the community, the adult entertainment world, I'll give you a perfect example. When I had a stroke, my boyfriend created a GoFundMe for me. And the only people that donated to my GoFundMe were all from the adult entertainment world. Not people that I've known for 20 years, not people that, knew I had a child and I'm a single mom. It says a lot about this community. The people within porn are so wonderful. They're just absolutely wonderful human beings. And we all, in that community I have a sense of, I relate to those people because we have that commonality similar to the stroke survivors. Like, you only understand what it's like to be treated a certain way when you're in that community. And I already experienced that from being in porn and having so much negativity and challenges with people not accepting this lifestyle, which I've never understood because it's not harmful to anyone. I don't hurt anyone. I never have ill intentions with anyone. And I respect other people's beliefs and the fact that this isn't for everyone and they just don't understand it. So it is an interesting parallel to have the adult world and to be kind of the black sheep of society already. And then now I'm in porn with a disability. So you have a lot of layers to that, which it's already difficult psychologically to deal with a lot of the repercussions that come from being an adult entertainer. So to have stroke on top of it, it just adds another layer of challenge and difficulties. But that's also why it's so critically important to me to spread more awareness about porn and disabilities. So there are two huge projects here and, passions of mine that intertwine now. So it makes it even more important to me to humanize porn and to give people an idea of like what really happens. Like the fact that I am a real person. I have a real life. These things happen to everyone. It actually is a blessing for me to be able to stand on that platform and say, this happened to me. I survived and I'm in this industry and I'm a human being at the end of the day. So it really is an interesting experience. My life is definitely unconventional for sure. All these different things happen in my life too. It's like, wow, I mean, this is really like, this is a movie in my mind. My life is so strange and interesting and bizarre as it is. And then you have a stroke, which is also an obscure thing that not a lot of people, fortunately, experience in their life. So there are a lot of prongs in my life tree here.
So, I mean, then how has the stroke and your disabilities then changed the way you work professionally?
It definitely, physically, I've noticed it's exhausting for me more so than it would be. And I watch, playbacks. I watch everything that I create, and it frustrates me a lot of the time because I'm like, God, I just like seem like I don't have enough energy there. And it's because I'm in my head so much. And that's also something new that came from this is I overthink everything. I was always a perfectionist before, but it was almost effortless, where every single thing that I do now, every word, every action is so overanalyzed because my brain is working so hard to try to make that a reality. It's trying to put the thought into the action. That task alone is 20 times harder than it was previously. So remembering lines, or even, like I said, just even being on set at a certain time and day is extremely difficult. And then once I'm there, we have long days. I'm on set for 14 hours half the time. And man, by a couple hours in, I'm ready for a nap. My energy just is gone. And I noticed too, especially towards the end of the day and night, that's when you start really hearing I slur my words more, because it's like shutting down. I'm the robot that's slowly like turning off for the night. And I start
It's like when your phone goes into battery saver mode.
Exactly. You're in low power mode. I kind of I start losing the pieces of everything. My hand will start closing up and I drop things. When I'm tired, you can actually start seeing a lot of the droop comes back, which is really kind of a bizarre physical phenomena. It's like I'm having a stroke all over again. Start getting tired. And that's scary too. When you start feeling and seeing those familiar indicators, then it creates a whole other issue, because I am trying to focus on work and trying to get things done, and I do the grocery shopping and the cooking and all these other things that you do in your normal life. And on top of having an insanely demanding career, I'm not just a performer, I'm a director, I'm a production manager, and I'm the chief brand officer for a company called AltErotic. So my job is 24 hours a day, on top of having a young child that I'm a single mom, so I care for exclusively, and having health problems, and then trying to do everything else. I mean, it's like you can only do so many things in a day.
I'm getting tired just listening to that list. That sounds exhausting.
It is. Me just thinking about it, I'm like, man, I'm tired just thinking about all the things I have to do. So it's already demanding before the stroke, and now you have a serious health implication that affects it. It deeply affects it, everything that you do. Meanwhile, everybody doesn't have any sympathy anymore for you because this is old news. It was 6 months ago. So there's a lot to it. It's like, oh, we're still doing the stroke thing. Oh, okay, sure. It's suck it up and go to work. But there are so many more complications than I think people even realize. So it's all a balancing act. I try to slow everything down. I try not to overwork myself. There are a lot of people that would disagree with that, but I try not to push myself to a limit, and I've been good about it. When I recognize that I'm doing too much, I pull the plug on whatever it is that I'm doing, and that is difficult for me because, like I've said, I'm incredibly passionate and driven, and I love my job, and I don't want to allow my health to negatively impact my career and my colleagues. And that's important to me. And that's a battle that I deal with all the time. Like when I have to cancel something or reschedule, or I just don't have the ability to do it, it just kills me. And
Right.
That's where it goes back to that kind of depressive cycle where then I feel bad and then I beat myself up. So it's a learning process on not just how to interact with the world, it's learning to be kind to yourself. Because before that, I'd run myself into the ground.
Yeah.
And now it's like I'm trying to treat myself with more love and patience also.
And at 6 months in, this is really still just the very beginning of a process, and you're still learning so much about yourself and what you can do and what you need to do.
100%. It's definitely a day-to-day, and I know that this is a marathon.
Yeah.
This is a long journey, and this is forever. And that's also something that I think we have to constantly remind ourselves, is that this is literally just the beginning. And this is something that this is your new life. And I think in some ways you kind of get disillusioned. You think, oh, maybe this is temporary, or, some of these things will come back. I'm going to wake up one day and everything will be back to normal. And unfortunately it's not. So that's something that we have to deal with also, is just knowing that nothing will ever be the same is something that I think takes a long time for people to actually accept.
So, as someone who's now living with some of these cognitive deficits, memory and other things like that, and relating to your other colleagues in the industry, how do you, with some of the cognitive challenges, how do you navigate then issues around consent and enthusiastic consent? And
in our industry, which is kind of for somebody, an outsider looking in, they question our industry for a lot of, they think that their diseases are rampant, and it's kind of a wild, wild west of a underground world that they don't understand. When porn is industry porn, and I'm specifically talking about the industry, is one of the most highly regulated businesses in existence. Myself personally, I am STD tested, blood tested, urine tested. Every 14 days, I'm required to be tested for everything. HIV, hepatitis, all these different diseases. And regularly, I don't know anyone that is outside of the industry that tests to that frequency. I've never seen it. Even if you're sexually active, there are people that go out and, they have casual sex at bars and stuff, and I don't see people going and getting tested the next day. So our industry is extremely careful, extremely safe. Consent is the biggest issue that we have on sets. And I can speak in my experience. I know that there are issues around consent in the industry. I personally can say I've never seen that. I've never witnessed any kind of issues with consent. I do know that they happen, unfortunately, and I'm not ignorant to that fact. But as a majority, the industry is extremely careful, extremely safe. And we go to extreme measures to ensure that that consent is upheld. And on set, for example, a lot of times we do video disclaimers before and after. All of the paperwork is done prior to shooting. And for me, it's kind of interesting because my disability obviously impacts my brain and my ability to think. So I guess you could say at some point, maybe that could be a consent issue. If I'm not in the right capacity in my mind to actually consent to these things, does that make it legitimate consent? For myself personally, I feel like I am capable enough cognitively to consent to these kind of activities, especially because it's something that I did before, where I don't know what that would look like for other people that have disabilities. I definitely encourage everyone who is interested in being in sex work to fulfill that desire and dream if that's what they so choose. But I caution people, any people, regardless of disability, to join this industry because it is a serious, you alienate yourself from the rest of the world. As soon as you open the door to porn, you close every other one. And I never wanted to believe that. I always thought that I would be the one that I could do anything after this. And I'm learning more and more just how serious of a commitment it is. And I struggled with that for years. I kind of had my toe in. I always wanted to be in this industry. I have done so many other things in my life, and my education is extensive, and I literally could do anything. I was going to go to law school at one point. I had all those opportunities available to me, and I just always was drawn to this industry, and I've never been happier. This was the best choice I ever made, but that doesn't come easily, and it doesn't come without consequences, unfortunately, which is still so crazy to me that you're in the largest industry in the world, the most lucrative business. Most people, adult people, consume porn, yet there's so much negativity and stigma against the industry. It's like we're there for consumption, but we're not good enough to be deemed as humans and have access to even, I've seen people with their children get taken away because of what they do. They don't get access to governmental programs or services that everyone else is entitled to. It's a really serious issue when you start looking at it on a deeper level. Like, it's incredibly inhumane how sex workers are treated in this country and in the world. So a lot of what I advocate for too is to try to get equal treatment for sex workers, and especially sex workers with disabilities. It's already impossible to try to operate in a normal society as a sex worker, and then now you have a disability. It just creates a huge barrier. And it's really unfortunate to me because, once again, we're all human beings at the end of the day. And in our industry, which is unfortunately prevalent also, there are a lot of people that have struggled with trauma in their lives, with substance abuse problems. This industry kind of attracts a lot of, I call it the island of misfit toys. And they're still they're wonderful, beautiful people, very and kind-hearted. And I've never seen so much just kindness and brilliant. The people I work with, I love talking with people because you learn about their pasts and their families. And some people have some really sad stories. But for the majority, everybody's just, hey, a normal person, and we just have sex on camera, and then we go home. So it's interesting to learn more about the people that make up this industry. But we have a lot of cards stacked against us. I unfortunately have been in situations with people where people have tried to blackmail me. They've sent videos to my father, who is an attorney. He was sent videos of me. Mm-hmm. It's just absolutely sick and horrible, and how people use this against you. And that's disturbing to me a lot. And luckily, I don't deal with it as often as some people unfortunately do. But when it does impact you, it really is upsetting that we're treated this way. So I've made it my mission to try to level the playing field and make it clear to everyone else that, one, it's a business, it's a career, and it shouldn't define who you are as a friend or a daughter or a mother or anyone. We're still all people at the end of the day with lives and people who care about us, which is the same for people with disabilities too. That's where there's a parallel too. You just want to be understood and accepted. And it's interesting to have that parallel between being disabled and then being in the sex industry. And I think that's kind of an interesting parallel that a lot of people didn't think maybe existed either.
Well, I think what's really interesting is so many more people are now being able to share their voice and share their experiences through social media and through all of these different platforms. So we're really starting to hear from a lot more communities that we didn't actually hear from before.
And that brings us to our hack of the week. But first, let's talk about sponsor Modus Nova. I took a break from using my Modus hand for a couple of weeks, and I'm so happy to get started again. For one thing, I really want to start climbing those leaderboards again. It's like back in the arcades I would frequent in the 80s, or really it was just sort of the corner deli that had 2 or 3 video games, where you saw the ranking of the top 10 or 20 highest scores on the game, and you wanted to beat both your friends and strangers. The Modus Hand is an air-powered, AI-controlled robotic exoskeleton that I wear on my affected arm for about an hour a day while I do exercises and play video games with a leaderboard. It helps me move my affected hand when I need the help, and it resists my movement when I need resistance for more effective workout. It helps me get in the thousands of repetitions I need for recovery in a fun and challenging way. To find out if Modus Nova can help you recover the use of an affected limb, visit strokecast.com/Modus Nova. Use promo code Strokecast for 10% off your first month. And now, back to our hack of the week.
You know, the one thing that I use more than anything is my planner. I write everything down. I have found that it helps me organize my thoughts, and it gives me a little bit of a sense of comfort writing everything down and being able to go back to it. I write down everything. I have to write down, and it's like people saw the journals that I have too. I obviously never had to do that before, but now it's like I'm dependent on writing down things that I do throughout the day, because I also don't want to lose those memories, because I feel like sometimes I sit there, I'm like, I don't remember the last 5 days. What happened? I mean, legitimately, I don't know. And if I don't have the reference to go back to, then I'm afraid that I'll lose those pieces of my life. So I think that that's something that's incredibly helpful as far as a therapeutic tool, also to be able to journal your thoughts and keeping track of everything that you do throughout the day. Then it gives me a kind of a sense of peace too. So I would highly recommend journaling. I just want everyone who's struggling to know that there's beauty after this. There's life and happiness. And if anything, it enhances just how precious everything and everyone in your life is. I catch myself, I pause more and be in that moment more presently, which is really a wonderful gift that I didn't have before. The ability to pause time in that moment and truly just appreciate every detail. And I think that that's a wonderful thing to have.
So, Misha, this has been absolutely fantastic. If folks want to know more about you and what you're up to, where should they go?
You can find me, MishaMontana.com is my website. I'm on Instagram at the Misha Montana, and I'm on Twitter, the Misha Montana. I'm also the production manager and chief brand officer for AltErotic. So any of my adult stuff can be found on AltErotic.com and other adult platforms as well.
Fantastic. And we will have all of those links over at strokecast.com/Misha. So Misha, again, this has been great.
Let's talk about sponsor Like-Minded from Heal the Brain with Jane. Like-Minded is a nonprofit membership organization for brain injury survivors. It's a chance to join a bunch of classes or learning sessions all about things like self-care, healing relationships, fine motor skills, mindfulness, gratitude, sharing your story, and really a bunch more. Online classes happen throughout the week, and if you need more flexibility, members get access to the recorded sessions as well. These are sessions led by occupational therapists, physical therapists, speech therapists, doctors, psychologists, and, of course, stroke survivors. Members can attend as many sessions as they want and even get access to a private text messaging group for more personal support. So get the support you need and deserve by joining Like-Minded today. Visit strokecast.com/like-minded to learn more. Use promo code Strokecast to save 20% off your first month. So I realize this has been a long episode, but it still felt quick to me, even when I was editing it over the course of a few days. It probably would have actually gone even longer, but I had another meeting to get to. I am really privileged in my role here to be able to help other survivors share the stories that really they ache to tell. And it comes out how much they want to tell those stories. And I am so grateful for that. And of course, one of the themes that comes through as Misha talks is 100%. It's her go-to phrase for agreement and governs really how she approaches her work and her life, going at 100% to get the job done. That drove her to get back to work as hard as she is able, and to continue to work on her recovery. I mean, she doesn't do things halfway. She mentioned that working really hard also helps her keep depression at bay, which is something that many stroke survivors have to deal with. Personally, I go back and forth on how healthy having so many projects is. I do have a tendency to overdo things, I suppose, in my life. There often will come a point where I have to stop, clean up some of the rough edges in my life, and build a stronger core infrastructure to support my adventures. But that's me, and that's the way I'm built these days. The right answer for just how hard to go, of course, will be different for all of us, just as our strokes are all different and our post-stroke challenges and advantages are all different as well. It's also important to note in Misha's story how multiple factors can come together to cause a stroke. In Misha's case, her COVID-19 infection led to her body doing more clotting than it needed to. And we had a conversation back in the beginning of this year with Dr. Jason Hinman at UCLA, looking at some of the exact mechanisms that lead to excessive clotting and stroke following COVID-19. But that COVID-inspired clot was able to zip through that hole in her heart, that PFO, lodge in her brain, and cause an ischemic stroke, which would go on to impact speech and dexterity and memory and energy levels and so much more. Fortunately, Misha is now fully vaxxed, so she's unlikely to get COVID again, though lingering effects from that first COVID infection can, of course, still cause problems for years to come. The hole in her heart is now closed, making it less likely that another clot will get to her brain. Those holes in the heart, that PFO, we've talked about that before. That's something that anywhere from 1/4 to 1/3 of all adults have. We have that hole in their heart that can let clots slip through, just because it's something we all have in utero, and it doesn't always close like it should shortly after birth. But the moral of the story here is to get yourself vaxxed if you haven't already, and whatever you can do, just don't get COVID, because it really sucks. For links to both Misha's Safe for Work profiles and for links to her adult content, head on over to strokecast.com/Misha. That's MISHA. Strokecast.com/Misha. Share this episode with the stroke survivor, hardworking artist, or porn enthusiast in your life by giving them the link, strokecast.com/Misha. Be sure to subscribe to the free Strokecast email newsletter at strokecast.com/news. And of course, as always, don't get best, get better. Thanks a lot. I'm Bill Monroe, and I'll talk to you soon.
The Strokecast, Bill Monroe, and Bill's guests provide general information and entertainment, not medical advice. Please do not make any changes to your treatment plan or the execution of your treatment plan without first consulting your personal doctor or medical team. The Strokecast is a proud production of the Currently Speaking Podcast Network.